Number 12. The people who buried their dead inside the walls of the living. There is a village in the highlands of Borneo where, for generations, the dead were not carried away from the home. They were kept inside it, not temporarily, not briefly. For weeks, sometimes months, the body of a deceased family member would remain within the same walls where the family ate, slept, and continued their daily lives. This practice, documented among certain Dayak communities in the interior of Borneo, was not born of indifference toward death. It was born of a deeply specific fear about what happened if the transition from living to dead was not managed carefully enough. The logic underlying this practice begins with the soul. In many of the belief systems found across the interior of Borneo, the human soul does not leave the body instantly at the moment of biological death. It lingers. It remains tethered to familiar spaces, familiar faces, familiar smells. If the body were removed too quickly, the soul might become disoriented, unable to find its path toward whatever form of the afterlife the community believed in. Worse, it might turn back. A soul that could not complete its transition was considered dangerous, not necessarily because it was malicious by nature, but because it was incomplete. Incomplete spirits generated misfortune. They caused sickness in the children of the household. They disrupted harvests. They visited people in dreams and pulled the living toward the boundary between worlds. Keeping the body inside the home was therefore an act of spiritual management. The family was not simply mourning. They were actively shepherding the soul through its transition, maintaining a kind of vigil that prevented premature departure. During this period, rituals were conducted, sometimes by specialists called upon for their ability to communicate with the transitional dead. Food was placed near the body. Conversation was sometimes directed toward it. The dead family member was treated as still present, still capable of hearing, still in need of guidance, and companionship before the final severance. The physical reality of keeping a body in a tropical climate for extended periods presented serious challenges that communities developed practical responses to. Some groups used elaborate coffins constructed of specific hardwoods, selected for their preservative properties. Others packed the body using resins or materials that slowed decomposition. The smell was not hidden, it was endured, it was considered part of the process. Archaeological evidence from funerary sites across Borneo suggests this kind of extended engagement with the dead was widespread and deeply rooted in pre-colonial traditions. Carved burial containers, storage jars of significant size, and secondary burial chambers all point to a culture where death was a prolonged social process rather than a single biological event. Some researchers note that this extended engagement aligns with broader patterns found across Southeast Asia, where secondary burial practices often involved revisiting remains months or years after initial death. The bones would be cleaned, sometimes painted with red pigment, and then reburied in a permanent location after the soul was considered fully departed. What makes this entry notable beyond the initial strangeness of it is the question it raises about what we consider normal. In most modern contexts, rapid removal of the body is standard. The dead are separated from the living almost immediately, but for the communities practicing interior Borneo burial traditions, that rapid removal would have been the disturbing choice. Abandoning the dead to the care of strangers before the soul had completed its journey would have been understood as a form of spiritual negligence, perhaps even as an act that endangered the entire household. The record preserves the ritual. What disappeared is the weight of sitting beside someone you loved while the air grew heavier and the days passed, and you spoke to them anyway because you believed they could still hear you. And if that sounds like the most intimate form of grief imaginable, the next entry takes a completely different direction, into a burial tradition where the body was not kept close, but was instead consumed. Number 11. The tribe that ate their dead so their ancestors could live forever inside them. The four people of the eastern highlands of Papua New Guinea practiced mortuary cannibalism as a standard funerary rite until the latter half of the 20th century. This is not a legend. It is one of the most extensively documented burial practices in the anthropological record of the modern era, and it came to global attention not through the discovery of ancient ruins, but through an epidemic that was actively killing people while researchers were watching. The practice was called consuming the dead, and among the four, it was understood as an act of profound respect. When a community member died, the body was prepared by the women and children of the group, who held the primary ritual responsibility for this stage of the mourning process. The consumption was not frenzied or chaotic. It followed specific social protocols. Different body parts were distributed among different categories of mourners. The brain, considered the seat of the deceased person's knowledge, identity, and spirit, was typically consumed by by the women who were closest to the dead. The purpose was not nutrition. The purpose was incorporation. By eating the body of a loved one, the living took that person inside themselves. The ancestor did not merely persist in memory. The ancestor became physically present within the community. This belief system was coherent within its own framework. The Foray maintained a view of personhood that did not end sharply at biological death. The substance of a person, the accumulated experience, the social identity, the spiritual essence, persisted in the physical material of the body. Burial in the ground meant that substance was lost, absorbed by the earth, made inaccessible. Leaving the body to decompose in isolation was, by forereasoning, a kind of abandonment. Consuming the dead was the responsible alternative. The epidemic that brought this practice to international attention was called Kuru. In the Four language, Kuru referred to the trembling, the involuntary shaking that characterized the disease's early stages. As it progressed, victims lost control of their movements, then their ability to speak, then their ability to swallow. Death followed within months to a couple of years of symptom onset. In the 1950s and early 1960s, Kuru was killing 4 people at a devastating rate, particularly women and children, a demographic pattern that puzzled early investigators until the link between the disease and mortuary cannibalism was established. Kuru is now understood to be a prion disease caused by an abnormally folded protein that triggers a cascade of neurological destruction. It belongs to the same category as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans and bovine spongiform encephalopathy in cattle. The prion responsible for Kuru is particularly concentrated in brain tissue, which is precisely the part of the body consumed by the women and children who bore the most concentrated exposure. The disease has an extraordinarily long incubation period, ranging from years to several decades, which is why cases continued to appear in the Four population long after the practice ended in the early 1960s following government and missionary pressure. The last documented cases of Kuru emerging from individuals who had participated in these rituals were recorded in the early 2000s, nearly 40 years after the practice ceased. Some researchers studying these late cases identified evidence of a genetic variant in certain survivors that appeared to confer partial resistance to prion diseases, a finding with implications for understanding human evolutionary responses to pathogens over long time periods. The grief behind the ritual was genuine. The love that motivated it was real. The people who consumed their dead were not performing violence. They were performing devotion. The mechanism that killed them was invisible, operating across decades, connecting a mourning woman in a highland village to the trembling and the silence that would come for her years or decades later. What the record cannot fully recover is the specific texture of those rituals, the songs, the words, the way a mother may have held something of her child and chosen not to let go. The next entry moves across the world and backward in time to a civilization that buried its rulers alongside people who had not yet died. Number 10. The graves where servants were put inside while they were still breathing. The royal cemetery at Ur, excavated in the 1920s and 1930s in what is now southern Iraq by the archaeologist Leonard Woolley, contains some of the most documented evidence of human sacrifice in direct service of elite burial anywhere in the ancient world. The graves dated to approximately 2600 to 2400 BCE. What Woolley found inside several of the larger burial pits changed the understanding of what early Mesopotamian civilization was willing to do in honor of its dead rulers. In the tomb, known as the Great Death Pit, Woolley documented the remains of 74 individuals, the majority of them women. They were arranged in orderly rows. They were dressed in their finest ornaments, gold headdresses, lapis lazuli beads, carnelian jewelry. Musical instruments were present. An elaborate golden lyre with a bull's head decorated in precious stones was found nearby. The scene, reconstructed from the physical evidence, suggested not a massacre but a ceremony. The attendants appeared to have walked into the tomb, taken their places, and submitted to whatever process ended their lives. Toxicological analysis is not possible on remains this old to the degree that would resolve all questions, but Woolley and subsequent researchers proposed that the attendants may have consumed a sedative or poison before the burial chamber was sealed. Small cups found near the remains were interpreted as vessels for this purpose. The idea was that the servants and musicians and officials who accompanied the ruler into death did so in a state of ritual preparation, not violent compulsion, though the distinction between those two things, in a context of total social hierarchy, is difficult to draw cleanly. The theology driving this practice was connected to the belief that the afterlife was a real destination that required real preparation. A ruler who arrived in the land of the dead without attendants dance, without musicians, without the apparatus of court life, would be diminished there. The servants who died were not being discarded, they were being elevated into a different kind of service. Whether the servants themselves understood or embraced this elevation is a question that archaeology cannot answer. What survives is their arrangement, their jewelry, and the cups. Was not unique. Excavations at various royal burial sites in ancient China, particularly from the Shang dynasty period, documented similar patterns of human sacrifice associated with elite burials. In some of the tombs at Anyang, the ancient Shang capital, dozens of sacrificed individuals were found in pits adjacent to the primary burial, some decapitated, some apparently buried alive. Oracle bone inscriptions from this period record the numbers of humans sacrificed in royal burial ceremonies, suggesting this was systematic and administratively documented. The scale and the orderliness of it is what makes the evidence particularly difficult to sit with. 74 people, arranged, adorned, prepared. The precision implies planning. The planning implies that the people who organized the burial considered this not just acceptable but correct. The system did not need to hide what it was doing. It only needed everyone inside it to accept that serving a ruler in death was a continuation of serving a ruler in life. The cups beside the dead remain the most haunting objects in the entire collection. What they held, and whether those who drank from them understood everything, is something the record preserves only in the negative space of what it cannot say. The next entry crosses to South America, where the dead were not just buried, but maintained in a state of active social participation for generations. Number 9. The civilization that refused to let their dead kings stop ruling. When the Spanish arrived in the Inca Empire in the early 16th century, they encountered something that disrupted every assumption they carried about how the dead were supposed to behave. The Sapa Inca, the supreme ruler of Tawantinsuyu, did not simply die and leave his possessions to his successors. He died and remained, his mummified body carefully preserved and attended by a dedicated household of servants, advisors, and priests, continued to hold his property, receive visitors, participate in festivals, and exercise political influence from beyond the biological boundary of death. This institution is known to scholars as the royal split inheritance, or the cult of the royal mummies, and it was described in detail by several Spanish chroniclers of the 16th century, including Pedro Cieza de Leon and Juan de Betanzos, though historians note that these accounts were filtered through the biases and misunderstandings of colonial observers. With that caveat applied, the basic outlines of the practice appear consistently across multiple independent sources. Each Sapa Inca who died was mummified using techniques that drew on the cold, dry climate of the highlands, as well as deliberate preparation. The mummy was then installed in a palace, which remained his palace. His lands, herds, and treasuries remained under his ownership, administered by his surviving kin group, called the Panaka. This kin group had an enormous institutional interest in maintaining the dead ruler's active status, because their own wealth, power, and social position depended entirely on the mummy's continued relevance. A dead Inca who was forgotten was a dead Inca whose Panaxa lost everything, so the Panaxa kept him present. The mummy was brought out for major festivals, he was carried through the streets, he was consulted on matters of state. Oracles attached to the Panaka would speak on his behalf. He was seated alongside living rulers at ceremonial feasts, and food and drink were offered to him. Chicha, the fermented maize drink that functioned as both a ceremonial and social substance throughout Andean culture, was poured into a fire near the mummy as a form of ritual consumption. When the Spanish understood what this institution meant in terms of land and resource control, they moved to suppress it forcefully. The mummies were seized, hidden by their panakas, or in some documented cases, handed over to the Spanish authorities, who in several instances burned them. The Spanish chronicler, Polo de Ondegardo, documented the discovery of several royal mummies in the Cusco area in the 1550s. His accounts describe the mummies as remarkably well preserved, recognizable by their attendants as specific individuals, still dressed and still treated with the ritual protocols of the living. What made this practice more than eccentric or macabre was its function as a complete political and economic system. The dead did not merely linger symbolically, they controlled assets, they employed living people, they shaped succession in a direct way, because every new Sapa Inca had to accumulate his own wealth from conquest, since the old ruler's wealth never transferred. This created a structural pressure for endless expansion. The dead were not simply honored, they were an active force shaping the political choices of the living in ways that the living could not easily escape. The last of the royal mummies disappeared into history under colonial suppression. Their locations, if any survived, remain unknown. What remains is the testimony of people who saw them moving through the streets of Cuzco, carried in procession, still somehow present in a city that was already being dismantled around them. The next entry moves to early medieval Europe, where the fear of the dead produced a very different kind of burial intervention. Number 8. The corpses that were dug up and mutilated because the living were terrified of what they might do next. Across medieval and early modern Europe, particularly in England, Poland, Bulgaria, and other regions with deep pre-Christian folk belief systems, archaeologists have uncovered graves that tell a story not of reverence, but of containment. The bodies inside these graves were not simply buried. They were staked, decapitated, weighted with heavy stones, buried face down, or had their limbs severed and repositioned. In some cases, the head was removed and placed between the legs or at the feet. In others, a heavy stone slab was pressed directly onto the neck or chest. These were not acts of burial, they were acts of prevention. The belief that animated these interventions was older than vampire mythology in its literary form, and more widespread than most historical accounts of folk belief acknowledge. The revenant, the returned dead, was not a metaphor in communities that practiced these restraining burials, it was a practical concern. When a person died under certain circumstances, through suicide, through drowning, through excommunication from the church, through moral disgrace, or during epidemic conditions, the community believed there was an elevated risk that the dead person's spirit would not complete its transit away from the living world. Instead, it would return, and a returning dead person was considered genuinely dangerous, capable of causing illness, crop failure, and death in those it visited. The archaeological evidence for this practice is substantial and continues to grow. In Poland, excavations at sites in the Masovian region uncovered a 12th century cemetery where multiple burials showed clear signs of anti-revenant precautions: sickles placed across the necks, stones on the chest, deliberate positioning to prevent the dead from rising. In Bulgaria, sites near Sozopol produced what became known in international media as vampire graves, skeletons with iron rods driven through the chest cavity. These finds date to the medieval period and align with documented regional folklore about the opayar, or vampire, in its original folkloric form, which was quite different from the aristocratic figure of later literary tradition. The English evidence is particularly rich. At various Anglo-Saxon and post-conquest burial sites, archaeologists have found individuals buried at the boundaries of settlements rather than in consecrated ground, with evidence of perimortem or post-mortem mutilation consistent with deliberate intervention. A site near Southwell in Nottinghamshire contained a medieval burial where the skull had been removed and placed between the legs, with precision suggesting ritual purpose. Researchers interpret these edge-of-settlement burials as connected to the belief that the dangerous dead needed to be kept at the margins of the community they might threaten. What is important to understand about these practices is that they were carried out by ordinary people under genuine fear. The mutilation was not cruelty for its own sake, it was protective. The people performing these interventions were attempting to safeguard their families, their neighbors, their livestock, their futures. The logic was internally consistent given their understanding of how the dead and the living interacted. The system of belief that produced these burials did not hide itself. It was written into the positioning of the bones, preserved in the ground for centuries, waiting to be read. The fear of the returning dead did not require fiction to become disturbing. The graves themselves are the documentation. The next entry leaves Europe entirely and moves to the high plains of Tibet, where the dead were given to the birds. Number 7. The ritual where the body was deliberately cut apart and fed to vultures on an exposed mountain. Sky burial, known in Tibetan as Jator, which translates roughly as giving alms to the birds, is one of the most visually striking and theologically complex funerary traditions in the documented world. It has been practiced in Tibet, parts of Mongolia, and in certain Zoroastrian communities in Iran, under the related tradition of exposure in the Dakma, or Tower of Silence, for centuries. Understanding why a practice that appears so extreme from the outside carries profound spiritual meaning requires setting aside the instinctive reaction and engaging with the theological framework that makes it not just logical, but necessary. In Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the body at the moment of death is understood as an empty vessel. The consciousness, the animating principle of the person, has already departed. What remains is physical material with no inherent sacred status of its own. Burying it in the ground, where the cold, thin soil of the Tibetan plateau makes decomposition extremely slow, is wasteful and ecologically difficult. Burning it requires enormous quantities of wood in a landscape where trees are scarce. Sky burial solves both problems by accelerating the return of the body's physical material to the natural cycle, while also generating a final act of generosity. The body that fed others during life continues to feed others in death. The process itself was conducted by specialists called Rogyapa, or body breakers, who were responsible for the practical aspects of the ritual. The body was brought to a designated sky burial site, typically a flat exposed area of rock at altitude. The Rogyapa would begin the process of preparing the body for consumption, breaking the larger bones and mixing the remains with barley flour, tea, and yak butter to create a substance the vultures could consume completely. The vultures, which gathered at sky burial sites in large numbers because of established association with these locations, were considered sacred in this context. Their complete consumption of the body was seen as an auspicious sign, an indication that the deceased's consciousness had moved on cleanly. Incomplete consumption was interpreted differently as a possible indicator that the deceased had died with unresolved karma or spiritual complications. In such cases, additional rituals might be prescribed. The Zoroastrian tradition of exposing the dead in towers of silence operated on different theological grounds, but arrived at a similar practice. In Zoroastrianism, fire, earth, and water were sacred elements that must not be polluted by contact with a corpse. Burial contaminated the earth. Cremation contaminated the fire. Exposure in the dakma, a circular tower open to the sky, allowed the body to be consumed by birds and bleached by the sun, after which the bones were collected into a central pit. This tradition was practiced in Iran and in Zoroastrian communities in India, where the Parsi community maintained it in adapted form until the modern period when urban expansion and declining vulture populations created significant practical difficulties. Both traditions reveal a relationship with the dead body that Western burial norms would consider foreign, but which carry their own rigorous logic. The body is not the person. The body is material. What matters theologically is what is done for the consciousness, the prayers, the recitations, the ritual support for the dead in their transition. The physical remains are a final opportunity for generosity rather than a sacred object to be preserved. What the records and testimonies of practitioners make clear is that sky burial was never casual or careless. It was precisely managed, spiritually anchored, and conducted with full ritual attention. The apparent violence of the process was not contradictory to reverence. Within its own framework, it was reverence. The next entry moves into the ancient Near East, where burial was not about the body at all, but about the terrible logistics of surviving the journey after death. Number 6. The civilization that buried their dead with maps designed to prevent eternal torment. The ancient Egyptians did not simply bury their dead, they equipped them. For a significant portion of Egyptian history spanning from the Old Kingdom period through to the Ptolemaic era, a central concern of elite burial preparation was providing the deceased with the knowledge, the words, the formulas, and the maps necessary to navigate the afterlife without being destroyed by it. What this produced, over centuries of refinement and expansion, was one of the most elaborate textual traditions associated with death in the ancient world. The pyramid texts, carved into the walls of royal burial chambers, beginning in the 5th dynasty, around 2400 BCE, are the oldest known religious texts in the world. They constitute the earliest layer of what eventually became the Egyptian funerary literature tradition. Their purpose was explicit: to provide the dead king with the verbal tools to identify himself to the gods, to repel hostile forces, to navigate the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, and to achieve a successful transformation into a permanent afterlife existence. Over subsequent centuries, this tradition was democratized. The coffin texts, which followed the pyramid texts and were painted directly onto the interior surfaces of non-royal coffins during the Middle Kingdom period, made similar protective formulas available to wealthy non-royal individuals. By the New Kingdom, the collection of funerary spells and guidance had developed into what Egyptologists refer to as the Book of the Dead, the modern name for what the ancient Egyptians called the Book of Coming Forth by Day. Copies of these texts, written on papyrus scrolls of sometimes extraordinary length and quality, were placed with the body in the tomb. What these texts describe, when read carefully, is a geography of the afterlife that was specific, dangerous, and full of entities that could permanently destroy the dead soul if the correct responses were not given. The Duat contained gates, each guarded by fearsome beings. At each gate, the deceased had to correctly identify the gate's keeper, state their own name, and perform or recite specific ritual acts. Failure to do so correctly was not a minor setback. The failure meant permanent annihilation, the destruction of the soul, in a final sense that Egyptian theology treated as the worst possible outcome, worse than any suffering. The negative confessions, one of the most analyzed sections of the Book of the Dead, required the deceased to stand before a tribunal of 42 divine judges and deny having committed 42 specific sins. The heart of the dead person was then weighed against the feather of Mat, the principle of cosmic truth and order. If the heart was heavier than the feather, if it was burdened by sin, it was consumed by Ammit, a composite creature described as part lion, part hippo, part crocodile, whose consumption of the heart meant the second and final death of the person. This judgment scene was depicted in extraordinary detail in countless papyrus scrolls, and the presence of the Book of the Dead text buried with a person was not simply symbolic. It was functional preparation. The person who had memorized or been ritually equipped with these texts was considered to have the tools needed to pass the examination. A person buried without them faced the judgment unprepared. The terror embedded in this system was not abstract. The detailed specificity of the threats, the named guardians, the precise weighing, the waiting creature, was the documentation of exactly what awaited the dead who came without their map. The next entry moves to a tradition where the dead were neither equipped nor guided, but physically transformed in ways that served the living for generations. Number 5. The skulls that were replastered into new human faces and kept inside the homes of the living. In the late 1950s, excavations at the Neolithic site of Jericho, in what is now the West Bank, uncovered something that archaeologists had no adequate framework to interpret at first. Beneath the floors of ancient houses and deposits dating to approximately 9,000 to 8,000 years ago, researchers found human skulls that had been carefully separated from the rest of the skeleton after death, and then treated with an extraordinary level of artisanal attention. The skulls had been coated with plaster, modeled to recreate facial features. Eyes were set into the sockets using shells. In some cases, paint had been applied to suggest skin tone or decoration. The resulting objects were not skulls in the way we might think of them. They were faces, reconstructed, maintained, kept faces of specific dead people. The Jericho plastered skulls, as they are known, represent one of the earliest and most striking examples of what researchers interpret as ancestor veneration in the Neolithic period. Similar plastered skulls have since been found at other pre-pottery Neolithic B sites across the Levant, including at Ein Ghazal in Jordan and at Kfar HaHoresh in Israel, confirming that this was a regional tradition rather than a single isolated practice. The skulls were found in domestic contexts, beneath house floors, associated with the living spaces of families, not in cemeteries or specialized burial structures. The implication is that these ancestral faces were kept in the home and almost certainly played an active role in the ritual and social life of the household. The specific theology behind the practice is not recoverable with certainty from this distance in time. There are no texts, there are no inscriptions, there is only the physical evidence of what was done and what it was kept near, but the comparison with other anthropologically documented ancestor practices suggests that these reconstructed faces were treated as present entities, not as objects or memories. The ancestors whose skulls were plastered were considered to still inhabit those reconstructed forms in some meaningful sense. The secondary burial pattern associated with this practice is also significant. The rest of the skeleton was typically buried in a separate location, often under the floors of houses as well, but without the elaboration given to the skull. The skull was singled out as the particular location of whatever persisted of the person. This is consistent with beliefs found in numerous later and better documented cultures across the world that locate the essential self, the identity, the spirit, or the animating force in the head, rather than in the body as as a whole. The plasterwork itself was technically skilled. Analysis of the composition of the plaster indicates deliberate material choices. The shells used for the eyes were selected for their appropriate size and reflective quality. The modeling of the nose, the lips, the brow is carefully done. These were not crude approximations. They were attempts at likeness, at recreation, at maintaining the specific individual presence of a specific dead person within the ongoing life of the family. The craftsmanship invested in them reflects the seriousness of the purpose. What the Jericho skulls confront us with is the possibility that one of humanity's oldest documented responses to death was not separation, but reconstruction. The dead were not put away. They were rebuilt and kept close and given new eyes made of shell so that they could continue to look out at the world they had left. The next entry takes a different approach entirely, moving to medieval Europe where the dead were put on trial. Number 4. The trial where a dead man was dug up, dressed in robes, and forced to face judgment in a court of law. In January of 897 CE, in the city of Rome, a corpse was exhumed from its grave in St. Peter's Basilica, dressed in full papal vestments, and propped up on a throne in a court of law. The deceased was Pope Formosus, who had died the previous year. The proceeding, which has come to be known as the Cadaver Synod, was convened by his successor Pope Stephen VI, and it constitutes one of the most documented and genuinely grotesque legal events in the history of the medieval papacy. The charges against Formosus were primarily political and ecclesiastical, centering on allegations that he had illegally transferred between episcopal sees in violation of church law, and that his consecration of Lambert of Spoleto's rival as Holy Roman Emperor had been invalid and treasonous. Stephen VI, whose hatred of Formosus appears from the historical record to have been intense and personal, was not satisfied with simply issuing a posthumous condemnation. He wanted a formal proceeding. He wanted Formosus to be present and to be judged. A deacon was appointed to speak on behalf of the corpse. The proceedings were not quick. Contemporaneous accounts, including those preserved in later chronicles, describe Stephen VI screaming at the body, berating it, demanding answers from it. The decomposed state of the remains, after several months in the ground, made the visual spectacle of the proceeding impossible to ignore for those present. The outcome was determined before the trial began. Formosus was found guilty on all charges. His papal vestments were torn from the corpse. The 3 fingers of his right hand, used for consecrations, were cut off. His body was dragged through the streets of Rome and thrown into the Tiber River. The legal consequences cascaded from there. All ordinations performed by Formosus were declared invalid, which created an immediate crisis because large numbers of clergy across the Frankish territories held their positions through Formosus's consecrations. The practical implications were significant and were not fully resolved for years. The historical record indicates that public reaction in Rome was strongly negative. Stephen VI was subsequently arrested, deposed, and strangled in prison later that same year of 897. A subsequent pope ordered Formosus's body retrieved from the Tiber, restored where possible, redressed in papal vestments, and reburied with honor. The Council of Ravenna in 898 overturned the Cadaver Synod's findings and restored the validity of Formosus's ordinations. The episode was considered an aberration even by the standards of a period not known for restraint and political violence. What the Cadaver Synod represents in the history of burial and the treatment of the dead is not simply a story of papal dysfunction. It reveals the extent to which the legal and theological status of a dead person could be treated as genuinely unresolved, subject to revision, subject to prosecution. The corpse was not an artifact of the past. It was a defendant. The trial was not theater. It was, within the legal framework of the institution conducting it, a real proceeding with real consequences, and the dead man in the chair was its subject. The record preserves the charges, the verdict, and the torn vestments. What it cannot fully preserve is the silence in the room when the questions were directed at what remained of the man on the throne. The next entry moves from institutional horror to something more intimate and more ancient, a tradition where grief expressed itself through permanent physical transformation of the mourner's own body. Number 3. The mourning practice that required the living to permanently damage themselves every time someone died. Across multiple ancient cultures, the response to death was not simply emotional, but physical, and in some documented cases, permanently marking or injuring the mourner's own body was not a voluntary individual choice, but an obligatory communal practice with social enforcement. Among the most extensively documented of these traditions is the practice of finger amputation and mourning, which was practiced among certain indigenous communities in New Guinea and has also been documented in the archaeological record of prehistoric populations in other parts of the world. Among some groups in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, including communities documented by anthropologists in the mid-20th century, the death of a family member, particularly a close relative or spouse, required surviving female relatives to amputate one or more finger joints. This was not self-mutilation in the sense of a psychological crisis response. It was a ritual obligation with clear social meaning. The amputation was performed using a stone tool. The severed joint was sometimes buried with the dead person or disposed of according to specific ritual protocols. The resulting permanent absence of the finger joint was a visible, lifelong mark of grief and relational loss. The practice was interpreted by researchers as operating within a belief system where grief needed to be made tangible and permanent. In a community without writing, without photographs, without the material record-keeping systems that allow the living to preserve traces of the dead, the body of the mourner became the archive. The missing finger joint was the document of the loss. Every subsequent social interaction involving that hand was a quiet and continuous statement of who had been lost, and that the loss had been real and permanent. Archaeological evidence suggests that finger amputation in mourning contexts may have been practiced much more widely in prehistoric populations. Analysis of hand bones from various prehistoric burial sites has identified patterns consistent with intentional perimortem amputation, and rock art from several continents including Australia, Europe, and the Americas contains handprints in which one or more fingers are missing, which some researchers interpret as related to mourning or ritual marking, though this interpretation is not universally accepted and the evidence remains debated. What is not debated in the New Guinea context is the social function of the practice. The visible, permanent marking of the body through grief rituals created a community of loss that was legible to everyone within it. A woman whose hands showed multiple such amputations had outlived multiple close family members. Her body told that story without words, in a form that could not be removed or hidden or forgotten. The grief was not private, it was public, permanent, and written into the physical form of the living. The obligation aspect of this practice is worth pausing on. The mourning did not belong only to the individual who felt the loss. It belonged to the community that witnessed and enforced the ritual. The system that produced these amputations did not need to justify itself. It only needed people to accept that the loss of someone you loved required a permanent mark on your own body as proof that the love had been real. The next entry is number 2, and it moves to ancient China, to a burial tradition that combined architectural wonder with the systematic entombment of an entire parallel world. Number 2. The emperor who built an underground empire for the dead and filled it with 10,000 soldiers made of clay, and possibly much worse. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China who died in 210 BCE, is the most extensively documented example of elite burial ambition in the ancient world. The scale of what was constructed around his burial site in the Shanxi province, and what may still lie undiscovered beneath it, represents a project whose full dimensions have not yet been excavated, and whose documentation raises questions that go well beyond the famous terracotta army. The terracotta warriors are the most visible element of the broader funerary complex, and were accidentally discovered in 1974 by local farmers digging a well. What subsequent systematic excavation revealed was not simply a collection of statues, but an entire military formation, with infantry, cavalry, chariots, and officers arranged in battle formation in underground vaulted chambers. Current estimates suggest there are more than 8,000 individual terracotta figures in the 3 pits that have been identified, each one originally painted in vivid colors, each one displaying individually modeled facial features with sufficient variation to suggest that real soldiers, or composites of real people, may have served as models for at least some of them. The warriors were part of the plan to defend the emperor in death, an army that would protect him in the afterlife with the same function that a real army would have served in life. This logic was consistent with Chinese burial traditions that placed functional objects or models of functional objects books, in graves, so that the dead would have access to what they needed in the world beyond death. The terracotta army was the largest, most expensive, and most technically sophisticated version of a practice, with centuries of precedent, but the terracotta warriors are not the most disturbing element of this entry. The primary burial mound of Qin Shi Huang has not been excavated. Chinese authorities have made deliberate decisions not to open the tomb for a combination of technical, political, and cultural reasons. What is known about the interior comes from a remarkable source, the historical text known as the Records of the Grand Historian, written by Sima Qian roughly a century after the emperor's death. Sima Qian describes a burial chamber of extraordinary construction, with a ceiling inlaid with pearls and gems representing the stars and constellations, rivers of mercury flowing through channels carved to represent the rivers of China, and automatic crossbow mechanisms triggered to kill anyone who entered without authorization. Mercury analysis of the soil around the burial mound has produced results consistent with Sima Qian's description. Soil samples taken from the mound show significantly elevated mercury concentrations compared to surrounding areas, which researchers interpret as consistent with the historical account of mercury rivers flowing inside the sealed chamber. The mercury, if present in the quantities described, would have created an extraordinarily toxic environment inside the sealed tomb, and this may partially explain why the structure has survived without known intrusion. Sima Qian also records that the craftsmen who built the innermost chambers of the tomb, those who knew its mechanisms and secrets, were sealed inside it after its construction was complete. The workers who built the passage leading to the burial chamber were according to his account, killed when the outer doors were closed behind them so that the tomb's secrets could not be disclosed. The historical reliability of Sima Qian's account is the subject of ongoing scholarly discussion, and not all details of his description can be taken as fully verified, but the mercury evidence lends credibility to at least the broad outlines of what he describes. The terracotta army standing guard in the dark for over 2,000 years is the image that most people carry when they think of this tomb, but the more you understand about what the texts describe inside that unopened mound, and what the soil chemistry suggests about the environment inside it, the more the 8,000 soldiers in the outer pits begin to feel like a distraction from something considerably more difficult to look at directly. And now, the final entry. Number 1. The burial tradition that required the living wife to burn on the same fire as her dead husband. The practice known as sati, or widow immolation, in which a widow was burned on the funeral pyre of her deceased husband either willingly, according to some accounts, or under significant social, familial, and religious pressure according to others, represents one of the most extensively documented, debated, and disturbing burial-adjacent practices in the historical record. It was practiced within certain communities and social classes in the Indian subcontinent over a period spanning more than 1,000 years, and the documentation it generated from Indian religious and legal texts, from the accounts of Greek observers in the ancient period, from Mughal records, from colonial British administrative documents, and from the testimonies of Indian reformers in the 18th and 19th centuries, is extensive enough to make clear that this was not a marginal or purely legendary practice. The earliest reliable references to the practice appear in sources from the first millennium CE, though earlier references exist and are debated. The Mahabharata contains accounts of widow immolation. Greek accounts of India from the period of Alexander's campaigns in the 4th century BCE mention the practice among certain warrior communities. Over subsequent centuries, the practice appears in the legal literature of various Hindu traditions, in regional chronicles, and in traveler accounts from visitors to the subcontinent, including Ibn Battuta in the 14th century, who described witnessing it firsthand, and various European travelers from the early modern period. It is critical to acknowledge what the historical record actually shows about the conditions under which sati occurred, because the theological explanation that was offered for the practice, which framed widow immolation as a voluntary act of supreme devotion that transported both the wife and the husband directly to a blessed afterlife, existed alongside documented evidence of coercion, familial pressure, financial motivation, and in some cases, physical force. The theological framework was real. The belief that a wife who chose to die with her husband achieved a spiritual status that both honored him and elevated her to a higher form of existence was genuinely held by practitioners and described in religious literature, but the circumstances in which women found themselves on those pyres were not always those of free choice, and the historical record includes accounts, including testimony preserved in colonial administrative documents and in the writings of Indian reformers such as Ram Mohan Roy, of women who who attempted to withdraw from the pyre and were forcibly prevented from doing so. The social mechanics that produced sati were not simply religious. Widows in the social contexts where sati was most commonly practiced often faced a form of social death if they survived their husband. Depending on the regional traditions and social class involved, a widow might be excluded from auspicious social events, required to perform acts of physical austerity, denied rights to inheritance, and treated as a fundamentally inauspicious presence by her community. The comparison between what awaited her in continued life and what was promised by sati made the choice, for some women, genuinely complex in ways that a purely external view cannot fully account for. The physical reality of the ritual was documented by multiple observers with a degree of detail that the sources clearly found both compulsory and difficult to render. The pyre was constructed, the husband's body was placed on it. The wife, dressed in her finest clothing and jewelry, circled the pyre in a ritual act. Then the pyre was lit. Accounts vary on the order and specifics of these acts, and on whether sedatives were sometimes administered. Some sources describe the wife lying with her husband before the fire was set. Others describe her entering the flames after they had already been lit. The accounts from British colonial administrators document specific instances, locations, and attempted interventions. Ram Mohan Roy, the Bengali reformer who campaigned actively against sati in the early 19th century, gathered case documentation and petitioned the colonial authorities specifically. His work, along with the efforts of other reformers, contributed directly to the Bengal Sati Regulation of 1829, which declared the practice illegal in British-administered territories. Enforcement was inconsistent, and the practice continued in some form in princely states and remote areas for years afterward. Isolated cases, some contested and some documented, have been reported into the 20th century, the most widely discussed being the case of Rup Kanwar in Rajasthan in 1987, which produced significant legal response and national debate in India. What makes sati the final entry in this countdown is not simply that it was physically violent, though it was. It is that it reveals how completely a burial tradition can be woven into the fabric of a social system in ways that make the theological, the economic, the social, and the personal impossible to fully separate from each other. The pyre did not exist as an isolated ritual. It existed at the end of a chain of social conditions that shaped who a widow was permitted to be if she survived, what she was permitted to own, where she was permitted to go, how she was permitted to be seen. The burial fire was not simply a religious event, it was the most visible point of a much larger system. The record preserves the law that eventually prohibited it, the reformers who fought for that law, and the accounts of those who witnessed pyres burning. What the record cannot fully recover is the interior experience of a woman standing at that moment of decision, inside a world that had already made many of her choices for her. Every ritual in this list emerged from a belief about what the dead needed, or what the living owed them, or what would happen if the transition between life and death was not managed correctly. Some of those beliefs were built on theology, some on fear, some on social systems that used the dead to control the living. The line between devotion and compulsion, between ritual and coercion, between honoring the dead and sacrificing the living, ran through all 12 of them. Tell us in the comments which of these 12 entries stays with you the longest after watching, and why. If you want to keep following this archive, subscribing means you will be there for everything we uncover next.